I spent countless hours analyzing every Watchtower article published from 1879 to 2025. Nearly 150 years of data, 30,000 plus articles. What I found will shock even longtime EXJWs like myself. And based on this data, I'm going to make two bold predictions at the end of this video. You ready? Let's get into it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and I finally had the time to do it. This video isn't about doctrine. It isn't about theology or failed prophecies, though we will touch on those. This is about tracking the actual words the organization chooses to use and stop using under each president that has ruled over it. You see, when you measure which topics appear in articles over time, you're measuring what the organization wanted members to think about and what they didn't want them to think about. And the transformation is absolutely stunning. I'm going to show you how a Bible study movement became a fear-based cult, then an emotionless corporate machine, and finally a real estate company begging for donations. The data doesn't lie. And by the end of this video, you'll see why they now talk more about money than they do about most of the fruits of the Spirit. Now, here's what makes this especially important. The Watchtower claims not to be a man-made religion. They say they're God's only true organization, directed by His Spirit. But the data reveals something very different. The religion changes dramatically with each man in charge. And it changes again in the 21st century when the Watchtower president isn't even a spiritual leader anymore. Now, before we dive in, let me explain my methodology so you understand how I arrived at the figures that I'll be discussing and showing in a series of charts and graphs. I didn't just count how many times certain words appeared. That would tell us almost nothing. Instead, I tracked what percentages of Watchtower articles mention specific words. Here's why that matters. If the word love appears in 50% of articles, for instance, that means every other article a witness read talked about love to at least some degree. If obedience appears in about 44% of articles, nearly half of all their spiritual food discussed obedience. This shows us the organization's messaging priorities, what they wanted embedded in members' minds through constant, repeated exposure. While getting this data exactly perfect would be nearly impossible, I'm confident in the results I got by pouring through and querying a database of all the Watchtower magazines going back almost 150 years. What I found there was a complete transformation of priorities from one presidency to the next presidency and into the 21st century. So let's begin this walkthrough of each president's tenure, where we'll watch a religion die and a corporation take its place. Ready? Here we go. Charles Taze Russell, the founder. Now, I'm not here to defend Russell. The man had serious problems. His failed prophecies, his personal scandals, there's a lot to this guy. But when you look at what was actually published during his presidency, something interesting emerges. The Watchtower under Russell had very clear priorities, and here's what they were. Faith appeared in about half of the articles published under his tenure. The word hope also appeared in about half the articles, as did love. Think about that for a second. Every other article that early Bible students read discussed these core Christian virtues. There was constant, sustained messaging about faith, hope, and love. Joy as well, about half the articles. Peace, about half. Patience, about a third. These weren't occasional topics. They were woven throughout the publications. Now, here's the thing that surprised me. Armageddon only appears in about 3% of the Watchtower articles from Russell's presidency. 3%, that's it. For a movement obsessed with the end times, it was barely mentioned in the magazines. Yes, Russell believed 1914 was significant and that 1914 appears in about 1 out of 10 of the articles of the time. But the fear based Armageddon is coming messaging that we associate with Jehovah's Witnesses today, that wasn't Russell. But, and this is important, Russell had a different control mechanism. Obedience appears in over 40% of articles under his tenure, nearly half. That's actually the highest of any of the presidents of the Watchtower. Russell believed he'd unlocked biblical chronology, that he'd figured out God's plan, and he wanted people to follow his interpretations. And look at this. Organization only appeared in about 20% of his articles. This wasn't about building an empire. This was about a charismatic Bible teacher who gathered followers who trusted him personally. Now, an important note about these control terms like obedience, loyalty, and submission, they were so high under Russell and also under Rutherford, as we'll see, because there was no disfellowshipping practice yet. The threat of losing your family didn't exist back then. So naturally, the publications had to push obedience and loyalty more explicitly. Once Nathan Knorr introduced formal shunning in 1952, witnesses knew the consequences. Be obedient and loyal, or else. The explicit language became less necessary when the threat became institutional, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So Russell created what I call a Bible study movement with a guru problem. People were following him, not an organization. They were studying scripture, not organizational procedures. And the content was overwhelmingly positive. Faith, hope, and love dominating the messaging. When Russell died in 1916, the question became, would this remain a loosely organized Bible study group, or would it become something else? The answer came immediately, and it was devastating. Enter Joseph Franklin Rutherford, also known as Judge Rutherford, even though he was never a judge. And folks, this is where everything changes. This is the inflection point. This is when the organization, as Russell knew it, died and something darker took its place. Let me show you what happened to the messaging during Rutherford's presidency, because the numbers, they're absolutely shocking. There's really not any other word for it. Armageddon, that term goes from about 3% of articles to 32%, more than 10 times as much. Let that sink in. Under Russell, Armageddon was discussed in roughly 1 out of 33 articles. Under Rutherford, nearly 1 out of 3. You couldn't read almost any Watchtower magazine without encountering fear about the end of the world in at least one or more of the articles. Organization more than doubles from 20% to about 46% under Rutherford, too. Almost half of all articles now emphasize the organization itself. Rutherford was building something Russell never envisioned, a corporate entity with centralized control. And here's a term that barely even existed under Russell: theocratic. Under Rutherford, it appears in about 8% of the Watchtower articles, but that doesn't tell the full story, because Rutherford began using this concept in 1938 to justify autocratic control. And out of the 101 articles that used the term during his tenure, 98 of them were written between 1938 and 1942. More than 40% of the articles written in those 4 years contained the term theocratic. It went from virtually non-existent to being a constant presence in the Watchtower magazine. The organization actually wrote in the September 4th, 1940 edition of Consolation, now called Awake, quote, "The theocracy is at present administered by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, of which Judge Rutherford is the president and general manager," end quote. President and general manager of the theocracy. That tells you everything about what he was trying to build. Now, look at the term 1914. It goes from about 12% in Russell's day to 30% in Rutherford's tenure. Now, the 1914 prophecy had failed. Russell predicted that the earthly kingdoms would be destroyed and God's kingdom would be established visibly on earth. When that didn't happen, Rutherford did something brilliant and twisted. He reinterpreted 1914. Starting in the 1920s, Rutherford began teaching that Christ's kingdom had been established invisibly in heaven in 1914, not on earth. He moved Christ's presence from 1874, Russell's teaching, to 1914. By 1930, he'd completely spiritualized the meaning. Everything Russell predicted for Earth actually happened in heaven, invisibly. Genius in a horrifying way. He took a failed prophecy and made it the cornerstone of their identity through reinterpretation. Then there's the term Bethel, the headquarters. That goes from about 11% in Russell's time to over 25% in Rutherford's. Persecution stays high at 27%, and Satan appears in almost half of all the articles. Understanding Rutherford's background is crucial in all this. In 1918, Rutherford and 7 other Watchtower executives were convicted of sedition under the Espionage Act for publishing The Finnish Mystery, which opposed World War I. They were sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Though they were released in 1919 after serving about 9 months, and the charges were later dropped on appeal, that imprisonment changed Rutherford forever. According to historians, Rutherford emerged from prison bitter and vengeful toward what he saw as Satan's organization, the alliance of clergy, government, and business that had imprisoned him and his colleagues. His rhetoric became increasingly hostile toward all other religions, especially the Catholic Church. This prison experience likely explains the explosion of fear-based messaging and siege mentality under his leadership. Rutherford was building that siege mentality. The world is ending, Satan is attacking, persecution is everywhere, but we are God's organization and will be saved. But here's Rutherford's real evil genius, and this is what made him so effective. He kept the positive messaging high. Faith, hope, and love are still in about 50% of the articles in his time, as are joy and peace. Rutherford wasn't replacing love with fear. He was packaging fear inside love. The message became, yes, Satan and persecution are everywhere, Armageddon is imminent, but have faith and hope because we're God's organization and will survive. It's brilliant manipulation when you think about it. Rutherford transformed Russell's personality cult into an institutional cult, keeping enough spiritual language to feel religious while building the control mechanisms of a totalitarian organization. This is the pivot point. This is when Jehovah's Witnesses stopped being a Bible study movement and became a high control group, a true cult. Rutherford laid the foundation for everything that came after. But Rutherford still needed members to feel something. His successor, however, would eliminate that requirement entirely. Nathan Homer Knorr became president of the Watchtower in 1942, and he did something I can only describe as the systematic murder of Christian virtue. I know that sounds dramatic, but just look at these numbers. Remember how faith, hope, and love appeared in about 50% of the articles under Russell and Rutherford? Here's what happens under Knorr's presidency. Faith drops from 50% to about 21%, less than half the mentions. Hope drops from 48% to about 16, only a third of what it was. Love drops from 50% to about 22%, also less than half. Joy collapses from 47 to 12%, one quarter. Peace goes from 48 to 15%, one third. And the biblical fruits of the Spirit from Galatians 5, rarely mentioned anymore. Patience from 34% down to 3%. That's a 90% decrease. Kindness from about 31 to 9%. Goodness from about 28 to 3%. Faithfulness from about 35 to 5%. Mildness and gentleness from about 18% to 2%, nearly a 90% decrease. Think about what this means in practical terms. A Jehovah's Witness reading the Watchtower under Russell and Rutherford encountered discussions of love, joy, peace, and patience constantly. It was woven throughout their spiritual diet. Under Knorr, these topics became more rare. You might read 5 or 10 articles before encountering even a mention of kindness. You'd have to read about 30 to see goodness mentioned, and about 50 to see mildness or gentleness mentioned. This is the death of spirituality and the birth of organizational machinery. So, what replaced all that spiritual content? Systems, procedures, organizational structure. The term ministry, for instance, it stays highly elevated at about 13% because a door-to-door machine was running at full capacity under Knorr. The term theocratic remains high at 7.5%, maintaining Rutherford's hierarchical control structure. But individual spiritual development, almost gone. Now, here's what's really revealing about Knorr. He introduced some of the most devastating doctrines in Watchtower history, but the organization carefully controlled how much members thought about them through strategic article placement. For instance, the blood transfusion ban was introduced by Knorr in 1945. This doctrine has literally killed thousands of people, including children. It appears in less than 1% of articles under Knorr, though. Members got just enough messaging to obey the doctrine, but not enough to really question it or think through all the implications. Disfellowshipping was formally introduced by Knorr in 1952. The practice of shunning that tears families apart, it appears in about 1% of articles, just enough to normalize it as standard procedure, but not so much that people would scrutinize it too closely. This is sophisticated information control, a cult tactic. Knorr understood that controlling topic frequency meant controlling what the members thought about and what they didn't think about. And look at education. The word college goes from appearing in about 11% of articles under Russell, about 1 in 10, to just about 2% under Knorr, 1 in 50. University drops from about 8% to 2%, and the word education as a general topic goes down from 22% to about 4%. Knorr made higher education almost unspeakable. And remember, this is during the 50s to the 70s when college was becoming more accessible to working class families. Knorr systematically discouraged the very thing that could have lifted witnesses out of poverty and given them critical thinking skills. Now, I grew up with this legacy. I watched friends from the Kingdom Hall skip college because the end is so close and Satan's world promotes higher education. I watched highly intelligent people work menial jobs their entire lives because Knorr had made education a dirty word 2 generations earlier. Now, Nathan Knorr built the Jehovah's Witness machine that still runs today. He replaced spiritual development with field service reports. He turned faith into compliance. He transformed a religion into an industrial operation focused on producing literature and door knockers. But that machine was built on a lie, and in 1975, that lie exploded. Frederick Franz became president in 1977, but he'd been the organization's leading theologian since 1942 when he became head of the editorial department. Much of what was published during Knorr's reign reflected Franz's theological influence, and Franz was heavily involved in one of the biggest disasters in Watchtower history, the strong suggestions that Armageddon would come in 1975. Now, I wasn't alive in 1975. I was born in 77, but I did grow up with the aftermath. People who sold their homes, quit their jobs, pioneered full time because Franz had convinced them the end was coming. And when 1975 came and went, devastation. Look what happens to the word Armageddon after that failure. Under Knorr, about 9% of articles mention Armageddon. Under Franz, only about 3% of articles. It drops by 2/3. They went far more silent about Armageddon because they'd just been catastrophically wrong and members were leaving in droves. The fear tactic that Rutherford had weaponized became unusable for a generation. But Franz Franz had a bigger problem than failed prophecy. In 1980, his nephew Raymond Franz, a governing body member, left the organization. And in 1983, he wrote Crisis of Conscience, exposing how decisions were really made at the top of the organization, how doctrine was developed, and how the governing body really operated. This was unprecedented. A member of the governing body, someone at the highest levels of power, walked away and told the world what was really going on inside the institution. The organization panicked, and you can see it in the data. The word apostate spikes to about 2% of articles, the highest in the organization's history up to that point. They couldn't silence Raymond Franz, so they had to discredit him. The word apostate became their weapon, and they used it regularly. The term disfellowship stays elevated at this time at about 1.2% when you count both spelling variations. They had to remind members more regularly that leaving meant losing your family and friends, so you better not. And the shunning doctrine became more important than ever. In fact, Franz made it even stricter. In September of 1981, the Watchtower changed its policy so that people who voluntarily disassociated themselves would be shunned exactly the same way as those who were disfellowshipped. And this conveniently happened just months after Raymond Franz's employer resigned from the organization formally, and Raymond was disfellowshipped in November of 1981 for simply eating a meal with him. The organization literally changed the rules to tighten control in response to the Raymond Franz crisis. Frederick Franz's entire presidency was damage control. He spent 15 years managing the 1975 hangover while fighting internal dissent and trying to stem the exodus of members who'd read his nephew's book. In that era, there were lots of talks and articles with warnings about apostates, about independent thinking, about trusting the organization no matter what. That was Franz's legacy, institutionalized paranoia. When Franz died in 1992, the presidency had been weakened. The governing body as a collective had taken more and more power. And what happened next changed the fundamental nature of leadership in the organization. Milton Henschel became president of the Watchtower in 1992. But in the year 2000, he did something unprecedented. He stepped down. Every single previous president had served until death. Russell died in office. Rutherford died in office. Knorr died in office. Franz died in office. But Henschel stepped down. Why? Because the governing body officially took complete control at that point. From 2000 onward, the president became an administrative position, a helper to the governing body, not a leader. The presidents since then, well, Don Adams from 2000 to 2014, and Robert Surenko from 2014 to the present. And here's what's crucial. Both men are part of what Watchtower calls the Great Crowd. They're not even among the anointed 144,000. They're corporate officers managing a business. They don't make doctrinal decisions. They're not spiritual leaders. They're just administrators now. And you can see this transformation and what the organization now wants members thinking about. Let me show you what's rising in the modern era. The term donate appears in less than 1% of articles. Since 2021, about 6%. It's nearly a 1,000% increase. Donation goes from 1% also to about 6%. The reason? Well, since 2016, every single magazine includes a donation request. Every single one, both public and study editions. They want you thinking about money every time you open the Watchtower magazine. My, how things have changed since Russell wrote in the second issue of the Watchtower, quote, Zion's Watchtower has, we believe, Jehovah for its backer. And while this is the case, it will never beg nor petition men for support. When he who says, all the gold and silver of the mountains are mine, fails to provide necessary funds, we will understand it to be time to suspend the publication. End quote. This was Russell's position on fundraising, that the publication should never beg for money, and if God stopped providing funds, they would take it as a sign to stop publishing. And now every Watchtower requests that you donate. Now it's QR codes and donation boxes and online giving and subscriptions and constant reminders that the organization needs your financial support. The term disfellowshipped is currently at about 1.5%. That's the highest it's ever been, even higher than when Nora introduced the practices in 1952 and Franz made it more strict in the early 1980s. Why? Because they're under legal pressure. Now, let's talk just for a second about Norway. This is important to get right. Norway initially withdrew state funding over the shunning practice in 2021 to 22. But in March of 24, the Oslo District Court ruled against the organization. But in March 2025, the Court of Appeal unanimously reversed that decision, ruling in favor of Jehovah's Witnesses and awarding them legal costs. But it's not over yet. The Norwegian state has now appealed to the Supreme Court, so this legal battle is ongoing as we speak. The point is, they're facing unprecedented scrutiny over shunning, and they're defensive about it. The term loyalty has ticked up to about 4% in the last 5 years. As everything else declines, organizational allegiance becomes more and more important. But look at what's vanishing. The term obedience drops from 44% under Russell to just about 2% today. That's a 95% decrease. The term worldly goes from 37% to about 1/3 of 1%. It appears in roughly only one out of every 300 articles. It's essentially gone. College drops from 11% down to 1/3 of 1%. Now, here's something crucial that just happened. You're probably aware. In August of 2025, governing body member David Splain announced that additional education is now a personal choice. After over a century of discouraging higher education, after destroying countless lives and careers, they suddenly reversed course. But they're not apologizing for it. They're not acknowledging the damage. They're just quietly changing the policy, moving on, and not mentioning it hardly at all in the Watchtower. That's the precedent. As the instances reduce, suddenly things change. The term Trinity goes from about 6% to a tiny fraction of 1%. You barely ever see it anymore. They've stopped engaging with theology almost entirely. The term submission drops from 15% down to less than 1% too. Now, some people might look at this and think the organization is becoming more liberal. They're not saying obedience and worldly anymore. Maybe they're loosening up. In some ways they are, but not completely, at least not yet. This is vocabulary sanitization. They haven't stopped demanding obedience. They just use different words now. Following direction, trusting the faithful slave, being loyal to Jehovah's organization, removing people rather than disfellowshipping people. I've said in the past, I do think they'll have to loosen up on control in all areas eventually. And you can see that in them sanctioning a number of personal decisions that were forbidden in the past. Men having beards, women wearing pants at the Kingdom Hall, you can go to college, you can clink glasses together in a toast, and some other small personal decisions they never should have had rules for in the first place. People are leaving the religion in record numbers, especially younger people, and they're trying to stop the bleeding with these changes. That's how I see it anyway. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Also remember, once shunning was introduced, the explicit control language wasn't as necessary. The threat is institutional. Everyone knows what happens if you step out of line. You don't need to be constantly told to be obedient when people already understand that the result of not being obedient is losing all your family and friends through shunning. I see this as someone who got out. When I was still in, the pressure to conform was enormous, but it rarely came from the magazines anymore. It came from talks, it came from JW broadcasting, from elders meetings, from comments that people would make at the Watchtower study where everyone knew the right answer. The written record has been more sanitized, but the control mechanisms are still there and they're still strong, though I do think in time that will have to change too, or the organization is just going to age out and die away. And let's talk about the content collapse, because this ties into everything too. In 2008, the Watchtower split into public and study editions. Before that split, they published 24 issues per year at 32 pages each. It's about 768 pages annually. Today, the public edition publishes once per year, and it's only 16 pages. It's a 98% reduction in content for the public. Now, they're saying less, they're publishing less, and what they are saying is increasingly about money and loyalty rather than scripture and spirituality. So, let me bring all this together because the transformation is complete and undeniable. Charles Taze Russell built a Bible study movement focused on faith, hope, love, and the end of the world. Those concepts appeared in about 50% of articles. Armageddon only appeared in about 3%. His movement was optimistic, scripture focused, and built around personal devotion to what he believed was biblical truth, as crazy as his teachings were. Joseph Rutherford killed that movement and built something else. He made Armageddon inescapable at about 32% of articles containing the term. He invented theocratic control. His prison experience in 1918 and 19 likely fueled his bitter, hostile rhetoric. He weaponized fear while packaging it inside hope. He reinterpreted Russell's failed 1914 prophecy and made it the cornerstone of Witness's identity. He transformed a Bible study group into an authoritarian organization. Nathan Noor industrialized that organization. He murdered Christian virtue, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. They all dropped 70 to 90% in the magazine. He introduced disfellowshipping and the blood transfusion ban while keeping mentions relatively low in print. He made education almost unspeakable. He replaced spiritual development with organizational hierarchy. Frederick Franz managed the aftermath of the failed prophecy and internal dissent of 1975. That disaster and Raymond Franz's defection defined his presidency. Apostate became the enemy, and paranoia became the doctrine. And modern leadership has completed this transformation. They talk about donations constantly. It's mentioned in every magazine now. They've sanitized the vocabulary of control while maintaining the control itself through the institutional threat of shunning. And the presidents themselves aren't even spiritual leaders anymore. They're just corporate officers from the other sheep class. The leaders are now the governing body alone. Here's the final proof. In Russell's era, love, faith, and hope each appeared in about 50% of the articles, like I said. Today, those three terms only average about 19%, 2.5 times less. Meanwhile, donate and donation are in every magazine. They make sure money is mentioned in every issue, but Christian virtues, not so much. This isn't the same organization Russell founded. That Bible study movement died in 1916. Rutherford killed it, nor industrialized the corpse. And modern leadership is running a real estate corporation that extracts money and loyalty while offering less and less spiritual substance in return. I spent decades of my life in this organization. I believed it was the truth. I really did. I defended it to everybody. I went out in service every week trying to recruit others into it. And when I finally left, it wasn't because I lacked faith or spirituality. It was because I discovered the truth about the truth. I found the institutional hypocrisy, the lies, the lack of actual biblical scholarship. The data I'm showing you today is just one more piece of evidence that this organization has been built and rebuilt by men, not by God. The data doesn't lie. Their own words, tracked across nearly 150 years, tell the story they don't want you to know. This is an organization that systematically replaced love with fear, faith with compliance, and spiritual development with corporate loyalty. If you're currently a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I want you to ask yourself, does the collapse of love, joy, peace, and kindness in the organization's messaging seem like spiritual growth to you? Does the rise of donation requests and loyalty demands look like what you think God's organization should be? And if you've already left like me, please share this video. This is objective data from their own publications. They cannot deny these percentages. Every number I've shown you can be verified by going through the Watchtower archive yourself if you have the time to do so. The truth The real truth is that this organization has been in decline for over a century. The spiritual death happens slowly, presidency by presidency, until what remains is a shell of corporate control wrapped in increasingly hollow religious language. You're not crazy for noticing that. You're not weak for leaving that. You're not an apostate for questioning that. You're just someone who finally saw what the data has been showing all along. You're not alone, and you are on the right side of this. All right, as I promised at the beginning of this video, I'm going to make two predictions based on the data I have gathered. Now, I've made these predictions before, but now I have some data to back them up that I didn't have when I made them before. So here we go. Prediction number one. I predict that Watchtower will sanction, or at least no longer prevent, the celebration of birthdays within the next few years. Why do I make this claim? Well, check out the chart. Notice how, with the exception of a brief spike in Henschel's 1992 to 2000 tenure, the mentions of birthday has dwindled, with only one mention in the last 5 years, and that was 2 years ago in September of 2023. Based on how the data is consistent with other terms dwindling over time, resulting in doctrinal changes, I bet this change is coming too. Prediction number two. I predict that Watchtower will sanction, or at least no longer demonize, the celebration of Christmas. Now, this is a bigger one, I admit, and it's going to take longer based on the data, but I do believe it's coming. Why? Well, check out the chart. Just like with birthdays, with the exception of a brief spike in Henschel's 1992 to 2000 tenure, the mentions of Christmas have dwindled over time, with only half the percentage of mentions in the last 5 years compared to the years 2000 to 2020. The data has shown that when Watchtower stops talking about something, change inevitably follows. And the word Christmas has only appeared in the Watchtower magazine 4 times in the last 5 years. The last time was in the October 2024 magazine. It's Watchtower's MO to have one article about Christmas, or at least that mentions it in a negative light, each year. That was true in 2021, 2022, 2023, and 24, but not in 2025. The October, November, and December magazines also don't mention Christmas, so it'll be interesting to see what comes of that, if anything. What do you think? Do you agree with my predictions or not? Let me know in the comments. Well, everybody, thanks for watching. I know this one had a lot of facts and figures, but this story needed to be told completely and accurately. Besides, my channel name is EXJW Analyzer, and I gotta live up to that. If you found this valuable, please like and subscribe. It helps more people find this information. And drop a comment letting me know what surprised you the most in this data, or if there's something else that you personally have noticed about how Watchtower's changed over the years. I'll catch you in the next video. Oh, and if you're still a Christian, check out my faith-based channel that's linked in the video description below. And also, check this out. I wanted to take a moment to tell you about my book, The Broken Mirror, Rediscovering Our True Nature in Christ. Readers call it a fantastic book where you will feel yourself discovering your identity in Christ. One reviewer praised it as 5-star material for the spiritual mystic or group Bible study. It's time to escape legalism and shame. Discover you're already God's beloved child with divine nature flowing through you. With what reviewers describe as excellent writing style and elegant prose, like a campfire discussion with a knowledgeable and gifted raconteur, journey from Genesis to Revelation, uncovering your true identity. This book shows how to access God's peace, wisdom, and strength from within. Your struggles become opportunities for divine light to shine through. Available in hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and audiobook. The link to the book is in the video description. May God bless your journey along His path for you.